We talk to IT professionals all the time that are trying to figure out how to best leverage the cloud. The first step many of them take is to use the cloud in some form of backup. And really though, that's not taking full advantage of the cloud because the cloud is just a giant dumping ground. So let's talk about some next steps. Joining me in that conversation is Jennifer Gill. She is the Director of Global Marketing for Zerto. Jennifer, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So let's talk about this. How do we go to that next level with the cloud?
We like to talk about disaster recovery as a great next step because you're able to not just replicate the data there, so it's a little bit more rigorous than what you're doing for backups. Backups are nightly, it's once a day. This you're replicating continuously.
Okay.
The data will be in the cloud. Then you can do a non-disrupted failover test and see how applications and data perform in the cloud.
So I really like that idea because one of the challenges, of course, with disaster recovery is testing it, making sure it all works and everything like that. And in the old days, that required getting servers and all this sort of stuff. And now we can leverage the resources in the cloud, right? Exactly.
And you're able to do it during business hours. You have to come in on the weekend. It's not going to cause a disruption to business. That's one thing that we hear from customers also is that, you know, weekends were for testing. And now that's not the case because you have the infrastructure available to you in the cloud when you need it.
So then the other thing I think that we see a lot is all these different cloud outages. So I think part of this hybridness is the also ability to leverage multiple type of targets, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So with one-to-many, for example, you can replicate to up to 3 targets. So we go to Amazon and Azure to provide you public cloud options. And then we have over 350 cloud service providers that offer a managed service. So you get not just the cloud infrastructure, but an expert to walk with you through your cloud journey.
Well, that's an interesting mix too, because these guys are probably, you know, if you will, high targets for all different types of bad actors, right? Where the MSPs are not, you know, it's probably they get their certain amount of attacks, but they're not the high value targets that these guys are, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And it's funny because you do see that we have had, you know, some high profile failures. So this, leveraging a model like this, you're able to take that away. So now you're not putting all your eggs in your one cloud, per se.
Exactly.
So now you're able to distribute it.
So then how does this process work? Do I go in and do I replicate all the servers in my environment, some of them? How do you guys typically recommend we do that?
Yeah, so I mean, if you're talking about your best next step, especially for someone who's early on, you can pick one application and replicate it to Azure, pick a different one, or maybe the same one to AWS and then to a managed service provider, and see how it performs. At Zerto, we actually had a customer, he did a failover test to AWS and found that the application ran better there, so he left it there.
Oh. And I would assume that each of these clouds also have sort of a sweet spot that they happen to run certain types of applications or workloads better than others.
So the customer I mentioned, for example, they do manufacturing applications. So, but I know our customers are kind of running everything anywhere, to be honest. So all kinds of things in Azure and all kinds of things in AWS, and of course with our managed service providers.
So now another thing, and we are kind of talking about hybrid cloud, there's also the concept of having some standby systems locally in addition to in the cloud. So that way if it's just a server failure instead of say a flood, you could just, you know, pop on a local box. Is that a capability as well?
Yeah, absolutely. With the one-to-many replication, so you can replicate locally. So a use case we talk about often is locally on flash. So you can pull something back quickly, like, oh, I deleted a file, something like that. I'm sure you talk with customers, they get their request anywhere between 5 to 30 times a day.
Sure.
And then, so they'll have that for their local quick fixes. They'll leverage a managed service provider with some geographic diversity. 2 to 3 day historical checkpoints on the journal. So then that's more for a true disaster. And then they'll leverage the journal for 30 days in Azure or AWS. And that's going to really meet 99% of their recovery options in terms of data.
Yeah, and so I would assume that in a lot of cases with like an MSP, there's a latency advantage because they're probably closer to your facility, right?
So it really depends. Like, so we have customers that leverage managed service providers that are like local, like 300 miles away, but then others go from like North Carolina to Las Vegas. So it depends really what you're looking for.
So before we end then, let's talk a little bit about what Zerto does, how you guys plug into this picture.
Yeah, so since I mentioned the different holding points, so I mentioned the journal. So that's basically a TiVo for the environment. So it could be a 4-hour TiVo up to a 30-hour TiVo. So all those checkpoints to recover back from. We also install seamlessly into the existing infrastructure, and we can go from VMware or Hyper-V on the source to Azure, to AWS, or to a managed service provider with no storage dependencies or hypervisor dependencies. So it really installs seamlessly into the existing infrastructure in about an hour. You can be replicating to Azure in an hour or two, and then have something there that you can recover to in about 2 hours for testing.
And the other thing I like about it is it's not dependent on a particular storage system to work, right? And I obviously would need that if you're replicating to the cloud anyways, right?
Yeah.
But even if I'm replicating to one of my own facilities, the fact that I can replicate from vendor A to vendor B is a pretty powerful option too, right?
Yeah, absolutely, because with the managed service providers, they're not going to buy the same storage that all their customers have.
Right.
So certainly cloud providers like that, it makes it easier to go to public cloud. And that's why I think Zerto has so many strong relationships with storage providers, because if they want to go in, they usually say, hey, we know we have a great storage system and you're going to love it. Buy one. Try it. We have this partner Zerto. Then we know you're going to come back and buy more from us because you'll see the performance.
Makes sense. All right, well, Jen, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So there you have it. The next step into the cloud is to really start thinking about it from a disaster recovery and testing capability, and products like Zerto are a great way to get there. I'm George Crump, lead analyst with Storage Switzerland. Thank you for joining us.